Hannah will introduce us to her studio and her work and share key lessons she has learned as a storyteller working in and in between the medium of games. Afterwards, Hannah will be answering some of the questions gathered prior to the event. And then if we have time, which I hope we will open it up to Q&A. We ask that you please submit your questions through the chat window and we will assist in moderating those. And now, without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce Hannah. She is a writer, game designer, academic, and artist working at the confluence of game and narrative design, writing, and digital art. Her work is always concerned with finding the right forms and techniques to allow a story and its community or characters to flourish in a compelling and original manner. Following a decade-long freelance career in the spaces between performance, writing, and play, Hannah is currently the creative director and CEO of Die Gut Fabrik, an indie game studio based in Copenhagen, and who recently launched the multi-award-winning Mutazione, a mutant soap opera. So please welcome me in joining Hannah, and I will officially pass the virtual torch to her.
It's a bit funny hearing biogs read out loud. You often write them for being read, not particularly for being read out loud. But actually there was a really key thing in that biog, which is pretty much what a lot of this talk is going to be about, which is around form. So that's a little spoiler that will become more apparent as I go through my slides, which hopefully you can all see. Everyone can see my slides, right? Just give me a wave if you can. Yeah, cool. And yeah, I will follow the chat. But as we said, we've sort of collected some questions beforehand that gives me a little bit more time to think through things and make sure that I've got any resources that I would want to hand over to you pre-prepared and in slides. So we're going to go through the preset questions first, and then if there are any extra ones, they will hopefully be in the chat and we can pick them up at the end. I will absolutely be sharing my slides as PDF, and there are like very clear references to certain books and stuff in there, which are you know, linked and stuff. So don't worry about taking notes from or screenshots from the slides. If there's any point where my answering a question is better answered through me screen sharing tools and things which are under NDA, I will do so. But as this is like publicly recorded, there are some questions which I might find it a little difficult to answer, and you'll have to forgive me for not being able to share things which are under NDA. Okay, yeah, without further ado, let's click through some slides. Basically, the very beginning of this talk, I'm going to take you a little bit through how I got to where I am now. I expect, although you should feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that a bunch of people doing a course which is connected to games and game design are probably interested in getting into that as a practice, career, study, etc. And I think that the best thing you can say is that all of those journeys are going to be completely individual. You can't take big, broad lessons, although I'm certainly going to speak in broad terms at certain points, from everyone's journey. So I'm going to talk to you very specifically about my journey so you can understand how I made, how I developed my practice and how I made my career work for my practice. Because one of the key things I'm going to give as a lesson is the idea of separating your career from your practice and how that can be useful and powerful in developing both. So my journey, I studied at undergrad drama. That was not like an acting degree, rather it's the study of drama. So it's like English lit, but just looking at plays, essentially. And, you know, sometimes we put on puppet shows, and sometimes we studied like ancient movement, and sometimes we wrote plays, and sometimes we wrote theses. So it was an academic study of drama. I went on from there to a playwriting master's at the University of Birmingham, where I studied as a playwright, and then I picked up by a number of young writing organizations. If anyone knows the theatre scene at all, the Royal Court Young Writers Programme was something that I joined, which is a fairly significant young writers programme in the European theatre scene. And from that point, I was like, right, hey, cool, I'm going to be a playwright. That seems good. And as you develop your practice as a playwright, a lot of the work that you do is different stages of work in progress. So you'll write a play and someone will give it a rehearsed reading, and that means that people have already decided where to stand, but they have scripts in hand. And then like your next kind of next step after that is a rehearsed reading off book, where someone will put on your play, and it's not proper, they haven't got costumes or sets or anything, but they're doing you the honor of reading your words and remembering them. And then you'll have your first one-act play. Your one-act play, you're not quite important enough to like fill a whole bill. They'll put on a number of one-act plays of up-and-coming playwrights, and it's like a little kind of taster thing that people go to. And so I got to the point where I had my first one-act play on, and I was 21, 22. I was in London. Couldn't afford to live there. I lived in a place called Wolverhampton, and I got the cheapest train to London, which meant I had to sit in the Natural History Museum with a bunch of dinosaurs eating sandwiches until it was time for the theatre to start. And I sat there in front of my one-act play, which was a play about a young, and this is, okay, so I'm 21, so this is 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I wrote a play about a young MMO RPG player who passed out while playing her game and meets her character in a kind of liminal space that could be her mind, it could be another place. And it was an exploration of identity and what happens when a character meets their maker, and everything the character stood for this player. And, you know, it sat in front of audiences. There were a lot of reference to dragons and stuff, which I thought was funny, and it was, people laughed. But I looked at this play and there was just something about it to me that didn't feel right. This was a strange place to explore the idea of inhabited reality and escapist reality, because there were so many textures of being and not being in the live lived performances of actors on stage saying lines that I'd written about people, and then you got further and further back in the layers, and it wasn't exploring in the form what the content was trying to discuss. Couldn't have expressed that to you at the time, but I knew that I was dissatisfied. Around that time, I did a workshop. One of the wonderful things about subsidized arts in Europe, particularly in the UK around theatre and playwriting, is that there are many, any stage of your career development workshops for free, just happening all the time in different organizations, all for super cheap. And so there was a workshop at the Soho Theatre called Playwriting for the iPod Generation. And you know, as we say, it was 15 years ago, so you'll have to forgive the slightly cheesy name. But this was a workshop being run by someone called Duncan Speakman on sound walks. Now, sound walks are gently interactive pieces of audio drama at which you are at the center. So you will go to a certain place at a certain time and press play on an audio recording, and it will ask you to walk through a city and recast it as a place, as part of a story which you are walking through. And there are different people with different recordings who also press play at the same time in the same place, who may have a slightly different recording, who may end up playing parts in the story that you're being told. And I suddenly knew, in a way that I couldn't express articulately at the time, but I suddenly knew that I'd found a form that much better expressed the idea to me of identity in the contemporary era and the things I was interested in exploring. So that was the first kick for me as a practitioner towards the forms that were more appropriate to the stories that I wanted to tell. And as I moved into more interactive performance, Pervasive Games, a really big company around that time, was Hide and Seek, and they ran these big games across cities, some of them like quite similar to ARGs, if you've ever heard of ARGs, which are alternate reality games. It's the idea of laying a fiction across a city and using those spaces. And again, also it's worth interrogating who has access to those spaces, who can play in a city is again something that requires a large degree of privilege, which shouldn't go without saying. But at that time, I was increasingly crossing over into these spaces around participation and interaction. One of my favorite things to say is that theatre is a game so old we forgot it's a game. It's play with rules, and it has become a form in its own right. And I see a very similar connection between theatre and games. Richard Schechner, who is interested in performance studies, would certainly say that sport, theatre, games, play, all of them have a similar heritage. Anyway, in this space, I begin to meet a lot of game designers because there are a lot of people in video games on the edges of avant-garde and experimental video games who are like, ooh, performance, this is exciting. And there's me in performance going, ooh, video games, this is interesting. Around that time, I'm doing a lot of work in different forms. I think it's fairly, yeah, let's click on a different slide and just talk to you about some of the things that I'm doing in this space between performance and games. So top left picture, you can just about see me with a very different haircut, talking to someone. And what you can't see is that there's a number of cards laid out on that table. Each of those cards has a 2 or 3 word title on it. And each of those titles represent a story that someone has told me about a game that is really important to them. It's a strong memory, whether it be from their childhood, whether it's something they played with a friend, whether it's something that they played on their own in the car on long journeys, or whether it's a video game. It's just important, strong memories connected to games. And every time someone comes in, I tell them that they can choose any one of these stories and I will tell it to them, but that's only if they give me one in return. And it's a storytelling exchange game. You can get one if you give one. And then at the end of that 24-hour durational performance, yeah, I was there for 24 hours. I might have had a nap sometime around 3 a.m., I think. At the end of that, I was turning it as I received the stories and I memorized them. I was turning it into a performance. So at the end of it, I did a kind of highlights performance, and that was part of the National Video Games Museum event. Yeah, it's a interactive performance in a very simple way. I've also done things like this kind of Lego scene thing is a picture from like a game jam that I ran between performance makers and game designers interested in this space. I decided to run a game jam that invited people to continue to explore that space. To the right, you see some of my participative performance work. This is Songs for Breaking Britain, where I formed a punk band. And with that band, I went out into the streets of different cities around England. We spoke to people in the street about what it meant to them to be from where they are from. That was the question. What does it mean to you to be from here? And the stories that they told us, we made into a song. And then that evening we did a gig, and their song from their city would be a part of that gig. We collected songs as we went around, and this is at a particular time of British history when there were lots of austerity cuts and a very right-wing government, and communities were at breaking point, and that turned out to be what the show was about. And then I have also done a lot of writing in and around video games. So to the left, you see these sort of 3 pictures. That's the cover of my Psychogeography of Games zine. And at the top, you see an illustration from some work that I did looking at the influence of Tony Hawk games on contemporary skate culture, because a lot of the names of tricks have been solidified by Tony Hawk. Before then, everyone had a local name for tricks, but when Tony Hawk came out, people decided that they were called this thing. It's a really interesting cultural phenomenon. All of these things, they have something in common, and that person is me. This is my practice. This is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in spaces in between and forms of things. But all of this is also a journey that I went along to working now full-time in video games. And that's a very specific decision I made, because I was pretty tired of working in the arts sector. The arts sector has a lot more funding in Europe and the UK than it does in America. That's definitely true. However, it is public funding, and therefore there are sort of artificially suppressed rates. And it basically, because so much of the work that I was doing was participative, it was in communities. Some of these communities, they often have money connected to them for you to work with them because they're particularly deprived. And when you're working with a community who has nothing, you want to give them everything. I was working every day of every week, over delivering, massively underpaying myself to try and run poetry workshops for women from the south of Sudan who were learning English. I was traveling all over the country, gathering stories as part of my practice, but mostly trying to repurpose the money that I got in helping activist causes. And I was massively burning out. Now, You may not believe me when I say that video games looks like quite an attractive workplace compared to the arts, but it pays better and the projects are longer. It doesn't pay as well as a lot of other things, but it is more attractive than the arts, and it was a pathway that I saw. So I made some very conscious decisions. I had a practice I was established. During this time, I also did a PhD. I forgot to mention that. If you are in any way marginalized, and again, this is from a position of a social welfare state where I was paid to do my PhD through a scholarship, and that it's even more common that happens in the rest of Europe. That's in the UK, you can get scholarships. In the rest of the Europe, you're just paid to go to university. So this is less accessible to people in America, but if you are in any way marginalized, never underestimate the advantage of having a PhD, because it allows you to be heard where otherwise you would need to prove yourself. So I get invited to speak at things because of that doctor, because of that research interest, because of my advertising the niche I'm interested in through the fact that, you know, it says PhD, games and performance, and people are like, sounds interesting. Let's invite her to the thing. So during that time, I did a PhD. That PhD allowed me to develop my performance practice. I used that time to do things for free that I would not have been able to afford to do on my own. So I was considering the PhD the career that was keeping my practice growing. And then I had enough of the reputation leaving the PhD to continue my practice. In wanting to move into video games, I made some really conscious decisions. So what did I need to do? What could I do in games? I was interested in writing and narrative design. And what therefore did I need to do? I needed to, 1, show that I could write, 2, show that I know about video games, and 3, make some contacts. So I decided to put together this psychogeography of games project where I went for walks with different game designers in different places around the world, local places that were important to them and that affected their game design, and talked to them about how their surroundings changed the way that they thought about space and place in their video games. So Ed Key and Proteus, Jake Elliott and Kentucky Route Zero, George Buckingham now goes by V and uses they, them pronouns. Holly Gramazio is a really cool Australian practitioner. Laura Dreamfield, you might have seen If Found, that came out fairly recently, which is a game where the main mechanic is erasing in a diary. It's a really lovely game, strongly recommend it. I went for a walk in Ireland with Laura. And in putting out these pieces, I leaned into my strengths. What were my strengths? I could write, but I could also perform. I pitched myself to a local London video games event. I lived in London by that point, which cost me a lot of credit cards, but was worth the investment. I think I will have paid them off in a couple of more years' time. That is 17 years later. Yes. I was speaking at a local video games event called Video Brains. It was monthly, and I pitched myself as a six times regular speaker, where each time I would go for this walk, I would do this talk, and I would do a performance talk on the basis of what happened. So, for example, I went for a walk with V, who worked on a game called Panoramical, which is a really cool architectural generator and music tool where you create different music scenes, and there are lots of, like, a bunch of shaders and generative stuff, and it's a really beautiful playful toy which allows you to create music and soundscapes and visualscapes, landscapes. And I actually used that tool to generate a soundtrack for the talk. And I also cross-referenced it with a bunch of protests that I had been on recently around public housing, because a lot of V's interest was in brutalist architecture in London. So some of it was a story about being beaten up by cops, and some of it was a story about V growing up and amongst this architecture and the feeling of scale and vertigo that almost gave a small child. And in between that was woven the sounds of Panoramical. That's an example of one of the things that I did. Ed Key, who is known for Proteus, was at that time working on a procedural folktale game, which I later worked on because I went for a walk with him. So you see how this works. A procedural folktale game. And so I did a procedural talk with him. We went for a walk. We got lost in some fog. He lives in the Lake District, which is a very hilly, mountainous area of the north of England. He took me on a walk. He did not know where he was going. That is something I've since learned after becoming friends with Ed, is that he always sounds like he knows where he is, but he never is, and then you're in some fog. I went for a walk with him and I turned it into a procedural talk where I got 6 people on stage. I gave them each a part of the talk. I asked them to shuffle cards, and then I delivered it in the order that was shuffled, and I designed it in a way that meant that made sense and was interesting and had interesting synchronicity. So I made a lot. This was not paid. I put a lot of work into this, and this was me concentrating on exhibiting my practice. I had other paid work at that time. And again, it is a luxury for me that I could pair that paid work with developing my practice and exhibiting myself, because I didn't have any substantial mental health issues. I did not have any substantial disabilities, and I did not have any substantial caring responsibilities. But this is my story. So I give those caveats. This worked for me. So I gave these talks, and what did they do? They showed I could fucking write. And to a group of people who are very used to not preparing a talk, even like just turning up with some slides and ad-libbing, like never rehearsing, someone giving a performance talk blew their fucking minds, and meant that I was using my strengths to tell the story, not just of these people and their practices and how I understood them, but also of me as a writer, as a person who understands things. That got picked up by Rock, Paper, Shotgun as a series of articles. And I have since worked with, I've worked with all of them now. I have worked with all of these people whom I did not know until this point. So this was also a very good way of making connections. Then as I picked up more and more work in video games, it was typically as a producer, because people who can fill out forms are a little bit alien to a lot of people in video games. Whereas if you've made a practice in art, you fill out forms every month for different grants and different academic funding bodies. You're always trying to find ways to understand the story that people want to tell with your work to their funders. And it's a bit of a skill, and it's something that I had. So I was hired, for example, on Ed's Forest of Sleep to get them some money. And I got them 100K from the UK Games Fund to produce a prototype. But I said, I'm not just going to be your producer. I'm also going to be your narrative designer, because you need one. And he said, yes, okay, because he's a nice man, and he believed me. And it was also the truth, which is convenient. I did the same with my next piece of work, where I met someone at a performance that I was giving as part of a Screenshake Festival in Belgium. And he said, oh, you got that money for Ed. Do you want to come and be our producer? We're putting in a European research grant fund for a storytelling game. And I said, yes, but only if I can be a narrative designer. To which he said, yes, okay, fine. If you get us the money, then we'll give it some of it to you. That's fine. And then the next time I apply for a thing, I just put the narrative design on my CV. I don't put the producer on there, because another thing to say is that as someone who is a woman in games, I would say that's not, I don't know if this necessarily applies to like femme people in general or marginalized people in general, but there is certainly something to do around the producer trap, that if you are perceived to have good communication skills, soft skills, just like socially or somehow like innately, then you can very often fall into the trap. Unless you really like production work is good, and good people at it should continue to do it. But if you do not want to be a producer and you are seen as someone with soft skills, then do that work only if you can leverage it into other work. Otherwise, you will end up being the person cleaning up after people and their poor communication for the rest of your career. So turning those production pieces into narrative design, putting that onto my CV, eventually getting some work writing for Mutazione, which was the forthcoming game from Die Gute Fabrik. It became really clear, I was just hired to be a writer, not a narrative designer, but it became really clear that there had been no one thinking about narrative design. And also the writer was not up to, the main writer they had at that time was not up to the task. She I didn't force her out or anything. She just decided that she wasn't into it and decided to move back to film. And so I took that role. I took an increasingly large role. And then was a point in that production, which was in process for about 8 years at that point, on and off because of lack of funding. There was a point where the people in charge of the company said, we are tired. We do not know if we can get this across the line. Hannah, if you can fund this, then you can have the company to run. What a gift to someone. These 3 cishet white men who had been running the company for a while, they were tired, but they could have just shut the company. But they knew that I could do that. And they knew what a gift it was to give me the reputation of the company rather than just letting it fizzle out. And I said yes, and I went to GDC, Game Developers Conference, which is where a lot of people go to make deals, and go to quite sad parties. Honestly, most of the parties at GDC are quite sad. I got us in total, the game took about $3.5 million to make, and I got around half of that from a deal which I made at that GDC. Unfortunately, it meant that we had to localize the game in 15 further languages than we were preparing to, and launch it around half a year sooner than we were really ready to. So it was a tough decision we made with everyone. And at that point, I became the company lead. And then I have lost track of what year we are in. I think 2019, they made me CEO, which means that I now have legal responsibility for the company. And that's how I am a studio lead and CEO of Die Gute Fabrik. We shipped Mutazione. Every word that you see in that game was written by me. All of the narrative design was by me, but it was made with a very, very wide, a vast team with a wide variety of experiences and backgrounds. We've got Alessandro Cronas, who's an Italian, who made the sound, which is also why the game has an Italian name, Mutazione. Think of like reggaetone when you say it, in case you're struggling with it. Nils Deniken, who held the world in his head for over 15 years. It's older than his children. These characters he's been drawing for longer than they existed. We have the incredible practical Christopher Doug, who's an incredible game designer who now lives in Australia and teaches at RMIT. We have Katrin, who was just a shit hot programmer. There were loads of people, and you should look at the credits. People make games, hands and hearts, and many people make games and hold them as they go from idea to launch. So we launched that game. It got critical acclaim. Didn't sell as many copies as we might have liked, but we are working on that. But you want one or the other. It's great if you can have both, critical acclaim and commercial success. But if you can't have one, if you've got the other, you're going to do okay. We got critical acclaim. People like the game. It won some awards. I don't know if I have a slide that says that. I don't think I do. Oh, yeah, we're into my journey though. So that's all good. Yeah, okay, cool. So what I'm saying is that every single part of that journey was planned and unplanned. There were moments of wonderful happenstance. There were moments of public support. There were moments where I made conscious decisions to say, I understand what my practice is. I understand where I want to go. And I'm going to make some key choices about how I exhibit myself and how I take on work that will mean that I can get closer to where I want to be when I do my practice. You could argue I have fallen into the producer trap again, in that I run a company and I do not write and narrative design on the next game. However, I have the great honor and privilege to be designing a team and a process. And instead of coming in and fixing a bunch of problems, which could have been solved many, many years before if someone had just thought about it, I get to do it myself. I get to make all those problems and then solve them later. So I'm also taking a great deal of pride and, is that the right word? A great deal of, it's somewhere between privilege and pride in radically redesigning the company and how it works. So we now pay a flat rate. Everyone gets paid the same, and everyone gets a bump after a year with us as a kind of thank you for sticking with us. This says that an artist is as valuable as a musician, is as valuable as a programmer, is as valuable as the person who runs the show. I'm very proud that we have more than 50% women on the team. that a third of the people on the team are people of color, LGBTQ, and I continue to make sure that we're not just hiring people of color or LGBTQ or women at the top of their game, but I'm also making sure that we're building entry level and intern level paid internships with a free laptop and that are paid at the same rate as everyone else, so that there's absolutely no barriers to participating in that, except you just need to be able to speak English and be on and be willing to be on our time zone. So I'm also making sure that we build internships annually into our budgets that enable us to build a team, which also builds back into the movement, builds back into people out there, the scene, people trying to make video games. So that is me. And I would say that if you're going to take one lesson from my journey, it is that it was a search for the form to tell the story with. It is a form-driven practice that I have because I am interested in understanding how the medium affects the telling of the story and what medium this particular story needs to be told in. What do I have to say? Oh yeah, here's the thing I have to say. Games are not special. Games are not important. They aren't exceptional. They aren't revolutionary, and they aren't the medium that are best able to express the contemporary era. And understanding what games aren't inherently and exclusively helps you make them those things. It will help you make a better, more important, more exceptional, more revolutionary game better able to address the modern age. Because if you understand the qualities of the material that you're working with, you can make conscious decisions about how to use that material, with or against the grain. But as long as those decisions are conscious and as long as you understand that material, if you just think the material is magical, if you just think that a lump of clay is inherently relevant to the modern era, how you work it suddenly becomes less important, and you're going to do a much less good job at making that work. That is the main center of my practice. And that's drawn from over a decade of interdisciplinary thinking. I have worked with technologists and academia and dancers and artists and comics makers. People who write comics, by the way, write the best game dialogue because they have a really good sense of line length. I have worked with scientists and researchers. I did a whole thing about the death of antibiotics. That was thrilling and really out there. I haven't worked with baddies. I haven't worked with anyone in oil or the military industrial complex. There are some people I have chosen not to work with. I don't want to introduce them into my disciplinary practice, my interdisciplinary practice. But on the whole, I have worked with a lot of people in a lot of different disciplines. And I think that has made my understanding of my own discipline much, much richer. And that's something that I want to offer to you today as a thing. These are the main lessons that I've gotten to over 15 years. I'm having to start say 50 because I'm like 36 now. I used to say a decade. And then I think right now I kind of have to say 15 years since graduating and going on that full journey that I just described to you. So these are my big lessons, particularly relevant to games people, I hope. So we had that first one. The games aren't special, young, immersive. They're definitely not a young medium. Do not allow people to use that as an excuse anymore. Do not allow it. They are in their current form as digital games, plenty of years old now. Film was doing really interesting shit after 10, 15 years. So don't use that as an excuse. And if you hear that as an excuse, interrogate it. Games are not young. They're just ahistorical because they have to rely on the idea that technology is new and interesting. And the interesting thing about it is that it's new. And so you can't refer to the fact that Shah Davis in the 1990s at MIT was doing VR experiments where you controlled your character through breathing. It was called Osmos. It was fucking beautiful. The ideas in it are really interesting. I met someone at a conference last year who said he just invented a new VR game, never before done, where you control it through breathing. And his game would be better if he knew about Shah Davis's practice, because he wouldn't be retreading old ground. He'd be learning from the shoulders of giants, if we want to really ruin some metaphors. Okay, so games are material. And I've already talked about that. Games are a material, and if you understand that they are material, that isn't inherently anything, but it does have qualities. Like interaction is a quality, choice is a quality, the screen and the spaces between the player and the screen, all of these are qualities of the material, and how you choose to work with them or against them, and all of the assumptions we have about how those things work. That, friends, is game design, and is exciting and thrilling. Oh yeah, I said point 3. It's good that the slide says what I already started saying. It means that we're working together. That's good. Work with or against the grain of material. Whatever you do, do it thoughtfully. And then the middle section is all about this difference between practice and career. Your practice is not your career. You can care for your practice throughout your life. It is you, and you will carry it with you. You may have to make decisions about jobs that you do that are completely unrelated to games, but you're still going to learn some things about yourself or about the world around you. If you're working in a bar and you're listening to conversations, you're going to learn about how people talk. If you're just paying some bills, you are doing the job of caring for yourself and the people around you. That stuff is important. And you can also do things where you say, okay, cool, yes, this internship is not directly in an area that I'm interested in, but I'm going to do it. And when I do it, I'm going to ask for some specific additional mentorship, perhaps. Like, yes, I will make you coffee for 3 months. But while I'm doing that, I would really love one mentoring session every 2 weeks where I can just ask you shit, right? So you can make career stuff work for your practice, even when it's not directly designed to do so. And then you can also be selective about how you represent your career in order to promote your practice. I am very much an A to B person. I know where I want to go, and I feel very confident about visualizing steps and solving the problems in between A and B. It is also okay not to be an A to B person. I mentor a lot of people, and in doing so, understand that there are some people who are more like a game of civilization where everything is a cloud and you just have to go in different directions until you sort of know where you are and where you're happy. You don't have to be an A to B person to look after your practice and your career. You just have to start moving and listen to yourself about whether or not this feels right, and just take conscious stock of where you are, and just keep conscious stock of your practice and how it's going. Someone who is a civilization explorer rather than A to B'er should definitely be keeping a career and practice diary, so you can be much more reflective about where you've been and what you enjoy and what makes you excited and what you've learned. An A to B'er is about looking forwards and planning, there next, reflect, didn't work this time, let's try this. And someone who's exploring like a map in a game of civilization, sending a scout out here and a scout out there, revealing the terrain, they should be someone who looks back, who reflects on where they've been and understands from that where perhaps to go next. What do I say here? You can take shortcuts with career, but not with practice. Thankfully, you don't need anyone else to let you develop your practice. Yeah, professional development. You don't have to stop learning ever. Isn't that exciting? You can learn forever. You can build friends now who will be your critical friends for your life. You can make peer connections now that will continue to enable you to reflect on any kind of media. You could hold a monthly game group after graduating where you all get together, you play a game, and you said, what effect did that have on me? Why did it have that effect? How did they do that? Or you could sit down and develop a practice for you and 3 friends where each let's say every 3 months, because you got to like sleep and have friends and be a real person and do sport as well. Every 3 months, you're going to do a 2-day game jam, and it's going to be a cover game. You're going to choose a game that you really like, and you're going to try and remake something of it. And through that, understand what you liked about that game, how they did it, and how you might do it. There are many, many ways to develop your practice. And one of the really valuable things you can do right now is think critically about how your teachers are teaching you, how that effect is had on you, how you learn best, and think about how you're going to continue to grow your career because you are the person who is, your practice, because you are the person who owns your practice. And it's grown through crit, it's grown through peers, it's grown through trying and doing and reflecting. And don't forget the reflecting one. That's really important. If I was going to be setting my own curriculum, I might do a thing for a week, and then I might research a thing for a week, do some practice for a week, and then reflect on it for a week. and then have a week off, because rest is also like the sixth. I had 5 fingers and I can't remember what all those points were, but there were definitely 5. So number 6 is make sure that you rest and take care of yourself. The most important thing is yourself, and looking after yourself and keeping yourself fed and healthy and happy. And then there's practice, and then there's career. There we go. That's the hierarchy of need. Somewhere there's internet in there. I can't see behind my ring light. By the way, I don't know if anyone has fixed ring light reflections in glasses yet. Tell me in the chat if anyone has like a ring light which is resistant to glasses. Storytelling is ancient but not magical. Okay, so we're moving to the story section now, and I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about key lessons I've learned about storytelling in games, because Mutazione is a storytelling game, and that I imagine is some of the reason that I was invited here. Storytelling is something we have been doing as long as we have been humans, just as play has been. It is means of reflecting, testing our relationship to the world, the things and the people around us. It is something we have been doing for a very long time, but that does not mean that it is innate. It is a skill, it is a craft, just as no one is born knowing how to build a fire or a bookcase. Equally, storytelling is something that a lot of people do, but it is a craft which you can do well with time and taking care of the practice of it. Storytelling is done with purpose. It is a craft. It has tools and vocabulary, and there's a big difference between being a amateur storyteller and a professional storyteller, and that main difference is deadlines. You can be an amateur storyteller who's extremely good, and you're doing it on your own time, and you don't care when you deliver that novel or that poem, etc., etc. If you are a professional storyteller, then you need to develop a different kind of tool set, which will enable you to not have to sit around waiting for inspiration. You need tools in order to do your practice on time. That's the main difference as far as I'm concerned. But it is a craft, and it is a practice that needs developing, and it has a vocabulary, which I think I have a slide about, so we'll wait for that. On either side of this ring light, understand how the practice intersects with other game design practices, but get ready to fight for it. This is a really crucial thing. Story tends to be, because it is such an ancient practice, and because a lot of people, we all live our lives woven with story. It's on the TV, it's in the news media. People are telling stories all around us all the time. It's in the books that you read to your children, etc., etc. Because it is all around us, it feels like a natural thing that everyone can do. But that means that it tends to be undervalued in professional contexts, particularly in video games, where I have often faced an attitude from, and it's a very stereotypical attitude, an attitude from people, the more technical end of video game development, which is still creative. I would never say that it's not a creative end, but who do not have the vocabulary to understand that storytelling is a craft which they may disrupt through their decisions. So my favorite thing to say in video game development processes is the change you have just made is non-trivial. Doesn't sound aggressive, but it does get across the fact that you have just arranged all of the islands in this puzzle game, and I had placed a setup and a payoff carefully in the critical paths that the player would take, and lots of additional rewards on the side islands. If you just rearrange all of those islands, then you have undone all of my work. That is okay. You are actually above me in the hierarchy of this game I am specifically referencing. And so you can make that decision, but you need to understand that it is a non-trivial change for me, and that you need to budget for a further week for me to rework this narrative design. You need to be able to fight for the story in the room. You need to be an excellent communicator. You need to be very clear about how things have an effect. And unfortunately, you need to speak with 99% confidence when you may only have 50% confidence in what you are saying. And that is where your peers and your critical friends come in. Because if you have friends outside of a company or piece of work you can go to, and you say, look, this is how I think I'm going to solve this problem. I feel fairly confident in it, but can you just like take a look or play the first day in this game and tell me if you think that what I think is missing is what you think is missing. Those critical friends will help you check your work when you're the only person in the room taking care of the story, where there are 10 others taking care of everything else. It took me a year to get italics in Mutazione. It took me a year to be able to write emphasis. There was never any undo button in the story tool. I had no spell check. Like, there were whole bugs that would completely destroy an hour's work, and they were just never fixed. I had to choose which battles to fight, and the one that I chose to fight for was italics. It was the player-facing fight, and it was the one that was better fought at that time. Understanding your practice, being able to speak about it, and having a good vocabulary around it will help you fight for it in the room, which is why it's 0.7 after all of the other ones. So what do I say? 5 principles for better storytelling in games, with a great GIF behind it. I can take no credit for that. That's Nils's exceptional art design and our 2 animators doing a really good job. Anna Louisa and Anna Louisa and Espin were our animators. Okay, number 1, vocabulary matters. Here's a really, really quick example. I am so tired, and I also extremely forgiving, because you have to be both, of people using the word narrative when they mean story. Narrative games, are we just trying to sound clever? Because it's a really obfuscating, slightly more complicated, chewy sounding word than story driven. Narrative is a technical term, and I do not think it is often the most appropriate term to use, particularly when talking about, story-driven games. I say story-driven games. I talk about the story of a game, because the story is the total thing that you will communicate. The story world is the world that you're building, and very often a game will just have a story world and won't be telling a specific story. So Slay the Spire is a really good example of that if anyone's played it. It's my favorite game in the world. I often top 10. It's probably the only game I'm good at in the world. Slay the Spire is a card-based fighting game, and it has a very clear story world, but you don't really need to know about it. Into the Breach, another good game, which is precisely the same. There is a story world there that tells you why you're there and why you care, and there's little snippets about these characters, but mostly it is a story world, and it's about the battles and playing your cards or playing your moves in a way that it allows you to solve the puzzle that's in front of you. It's chess, but with a story world. Plot are the events that you choose to tell as part of the story. Now, you may have a plot, some of which is not told in the end, but in general, you have a story, which might be the whole of my life as a story from A to B. But I might choose certain points to highlight, and that would be the plot. Now, you do not have to tell a plot in order, which is why it's different to the narrative. The narrative is the way you choose to tell the story, the order in which you touch on those plot points. And when you apply narrative, how you tell the story, not story, how you tell the story to games, you get narrative design, which are the design choices around how you tell the story, whether that be player interaction, choice, consequence, space, embodiment, game feel, mechanics, all of those things that contribute to how you understand the story, your place in it, and the spaces between those two things. So developing your vocabulary around storytelling in games will enable you to talk with others and communicate clearly and effectively about how their work affects your work and what you need from them and what they need from you. Understanding these things also makes you better at them. The hill that I will die on probably will be they're not narrative-driven games, they're story-driven games. Why do we have to make ourselves sound more complicated when actually being clear and precise is the more effective thing when trying to illuminate a practice which is ancient but not magical? It is a craft. These are just some of those examples. And you know what? The way that you learn more of that stuff is that you read literary theory. You read books by dramatists explaining how they build characters. Read books from don't read film books. Film is a really bad thing to learn from because people can make money from it. So there's so much snake oil out there. It's really hard to find the good books talking about good practices. Read books about theatre, read books about dance, read books about literary theory, Don't go too deep into literary because that one can fall over into too much academicness to be interesting and useful to a practitioner. I think like dramaturgy is probably one of, I say that as someone who came through drama, so I'm a little bit biased here, but I think theatre is a really good place to learn about some of these things. Anyway, narrative design is not writing. That's a really crucial thing. There are some people with incredible narrative design skills who cannot write dialogue for shit. And there are a lot of companies hiring a writer to do narrative design and a narrative design to do writer when they need to. And people who can do both are quite rare. Narrative design demands a level of tools and logic thinking, holding things in your head, building spreadsheets. All of these are skills which are useful, and they're about sculpting the material that you have to tell the story that you want to tell, and understanding that it's not just about choice, but it's about all the decisions you make when you make a game and how they affect or add to the story that you're trying to tell. Writing is the words, and you can have incredible narrative design, absolutely no writing. A really good simple example of this is The Gardens Between. It's a puzzle game in which you sort of inhabit the playful psyche of two young friends who are being separated because one of them is moving away. That's in the setup. The setup does it without words, and the setup is enough for you to understand that each of the puzzles that you try and navigate your way around is almost like a psychogeographical representation of a memory. You're like climbing over a giant sofa and a huge popcorn thing falls over and popcorn falls down as you try and solve all of these puzzles. Each of them is a memory which belongs to these two kids and their friendship. And it is beautiful and subtle, and you do not need writing for that to be effective and good. There is a lot of poor writing in video games. I am extremely exhausted by the video game talks to you like it's from the internet. It's like a lol butts style of dialogue where every character sounds the same and they sound like they come from the internet. It isn't always the wrong decision. If you take Night in the Woods as an example, it makes sense that all of those characters sound a little cliche. They sound like May, the central character, is sort of voicing all of them, because the mom does not sound like a real person, but she does sound like a millennial going, and then my mom was like, oh, honey, you really should go and get a job. And like, it makes sense because this whole game is about May creating her own psychodrama and May's experience of the world sort of being an unreliable narrator to the backdrop of the fall of late capitalism, et cetera, and local community. In that context, it makes sense that everyone sounds a little bit like they're too on the internet. That's fine. But I think that the success of games like that mean that people often think that that's the sound that dialogue in a game should have. And I encourage you to think critically about the voices that you put into your games. So there are two voices which games are quite good at. One is the lol butts, I'm an indie game, I come from the internet. And the other is trolls, ye hearken to the etc. It's the fantasy genre, and that's certainly a form that it's good to be able to practice in. But there are many others, and there are lots you can learn about writing, and lots to consider in writing. Is this something that is being read by the player? Is playing this game like reading a book? Is playing this game like reading a script? Is playing this game going to have voice acting, and so does it need to sound natural in people's mouths? You continue to make decisions about naturalism, realism, line length, hesitations. Disco Elysium is a game which reads like a book because it loves its pastiche of noir detective, right? And it has these reams and reams of like, and it's like reading a detective novel, and it knows that it is, and that's completely appropriate for Disco Elysium. But if you were to do that in Mutazione, it would feel super wrong and stilted, and you would have to tell the story in a different way. You would have to say this is like an ancient thing that happened long ago, and this is the record of that event. And there was a point when we were playing Mutazione with the idea of a long bar down the side where you read the dialogue there. It would have been much more like reading an ancient story that became a myth. In the end, we went with these sort of kind of text bubble style pop-ups. That meant, excuse me, radically reassessing the line length, and it became much more like the way that people talk. And then that affected my narrative design, because I was like, okay, let's make this naturalistic, let's build the story naturalistically. And that led to multiple middle style narrative design. I really am going to stop talking soon. There are only 2 more of these after this one. Writing is not storytelling. So this is the reverse of the previous one. So narrative design tools and craft is absolutely not the same as a writing craft. You can do both, but you have to consider them both as different practices and develop them differently. Equally, if you can write, it doesn't mean that you can tell a story well, and you might have a great idea, great ear for dialogue. You might be able to be extremely expressive, but structurally considering a story and how it's put together, especially in regards to how people will explore it, and all of those things connected to narrative design, there is another practice aside from being able to put words on a page, which is storytelling. Practice form-led design. I think you probably heard me go on about that long enough. Essentially, but it works both ways. This is what I actually need to say here. It works both ways. So I've done, for my career, I have often tried to find the right form to tell the story that I want to tell. I would speak with the community, I would work with them, and afterwards I would decide the thing that I need to do to tell this community stories is, I did a residency in a swimming pool that was being shut down because of community cuts. And I gathered all the stories of the people for whom this was an important place. And I decided to make a number of installations around the building which celebrated them and their stories. So you could open lockers and experience like a video installation, or you could sort of do a treasure hunt around the place. But I didn't know what I was going to do until I'd listened to their stories and worked out what was the appropriate way to tell that story. It works in the opposite direction. And this is about being a professional as well as a creative. When you are employed on projects, you're being asked to do a thing. And when you're being asked to do a thing, they may have ideas about how best to do that. But your job as a practitioner is listen to the effect that they want to have, but not just to unquestionably do the things that they think will make that happen. I'm being asked to, 4 years ago, write Mutazione. And I say, well, what is this? And they say, it's an ensemble cast driven soap opera. And I go, okay, that means I immediately make some decisions about the kinds of stories we're going to tell, because soap operas are the dramatic next to the domestic, the mundane next to the fantastical. And you have all these fantastical characters, so I'm going to give them extremely grounded dialogue and very convincing naturalistic characters. And that will, in the very form, be the mundane next to the fantastic. And you see that in the storytelling as well. If I was being given a procedural folktale story game to work with, and they were like, well, we're just going to have it tell stories, and that'll be fine because we can just, make it up by generating things. You go, okay, yeah, okay. But I'm just going to go away and do some reading on Christopher Booker's 7 Basic Plots and just try and understand how plots are made up of the same things in different arrangements. So classically, some people say the only difference between a tragedy and a comedy is that a tragedy ends in a death and a comedy ends in a wedding. Wouldn't it be interesting to think about being dealt a certain card at a certain point, which took the same story and made it a tragedy or made it a comedy? So thinking through the effect of your choices from the context of the form is part of the practice of being paid to do things. So someone says, hi, I am making a soap opera. And you go, okay, cool. Well, you probably need to get rid of some of this stuff, which I know is important to you about the story, but doesn't drive the drama, which is kind of what this has to be about. Anyway, characterization equals dialogue. Oh, if you are writing dialogue, I strongly, if you're someone who's really interested in like actually writing, making your writing better, the one thing I really, really want you to do is go and find some people to listen to, and to also find some books by theatre writers. Like it is as simple as that. Theatre writing is one of the best places you can learn about writing dialogue, and a lot of the way that people think about writing in games is as dialogue. and you are not going to learn how to do that well from video games. You're going to find in many different playwriting books wonderful character sheets that help you really quickly draw up a strong, interesting character. I have my own sheets that I make up, and sometimes one of the most useful parts of them is a dominant and a recessive character trait. And I usually try and make sure that those are contradictory. So, and that just really immediately conjures a really interesting character. So perhaps they are someone who is resistant in being told what to do, but very, at the same time, reliant on authority. That's going to immediately create a contradiction, which is going to make someone's, the way that someone reacts under pressure different to the next person. So find those character sheets, build those characters, and as soon as it is possible to go and hear other people talk, I recommend going and sitting in cafes and listening to the way that different ages, the way that different personalities take different, some people take control of a conversation. Some people are very sympathetic and they lean in and they make sympathetic noises, or the way that they might repeat the end of someone else's sentence in order to say to them that they were listening and that they're there and they are carrying on from that thought. I, however, know that if you were to listen to me, you will see that I jump wildly around in conversations, and that's because I have this terrible thing which I try and stop doing, which is that I finish the conversation in my head, and then I start having the rest of the conversation still in my head, and then I will say that sentence and I'll be like, oh, I'm going to tell you how I got there because I was listening and then I got really excited and then I started thinking about a thing. That affects the way that I speak, which I'm sure you can tell from the way I'm speaking to all of you. Sitting down and listening to people, it's about character, but it's also about age. One of the things that I particularly did in Mutazione is make sure the older characters used old-fashioned idioms and ways of expressing themselves. And that is something that can immediately create character in a show, don't tell kind of way. Show, don't tell being one of the largest principles of storytelling in theatre. Okay, we're now near the end of me talking. I'm just going to give you a couple of resources. So if you want to start anywhere at the space in between games, performance, play, and theatre, these are some really good books. Digital Performance gives you the 20th century in the spaces between digital and performance. Actually, some of the most interesting innovators in the spaces between digital and performance are dance. Dance, I think, because they are so much about the embodied space, got very quickly interested in the disembodied space of technology and did some really interesting work, like way back in like the 60s and the 70s. Equally, it goes as far back as like the Dadaists and the Futurists, and thinking about the ways in which the art movements, the art and performance world movements of the early 20th century were very much about disrupting the idea of author and audience. And from that arises participation and interaction, which is very much one of the materials that we work with. Digital Performance by Steve Dixon, absolutely invaluable. Artificial Hells by Claire Bishop is about all the ways in which you can fuck up when you use participation and interaction, and should be read as a guard against how excited you might get reading Steve Dixon. And then Mary Flanagan's Critical Play is just something that I have always just had on my bookshelf, and it just seems like one of those things which is, again, just very well informed about the qualities of material, because any work which tries to discuss the dangers of a practice and the potential successes and powers of a practice done well will be articulate and critical of the material and the practice of working with that material. So yeah, these three books I strongly recommend. And then I also strongly recommend, I'm sure that your teachers are working with you on good crit. It's like one of the biggest tools that you need to develop a practice is being able to look at your work and be critical of it. And you develop that practicing on other work and with others critiquing your work. After 15 years, I can really fucking edit my own work, but it took that long to be in that position, to be able to step back from it, to see how it's been put together. And as you can imagine, Good crit skills are massively relevant to narrative design, where you need to look at story as a series of moving parts, not as the effect that it has, but understand how those two things are connected and to play with the moving parts in order to make the story work. Liz Lerman's critical response process is a very short work, most of which you can find summarized online. And I actually have written a summary of this. If you put my name and Liz Lerman into Google, you will find an article I wrote summarizing it. Liz Lerman has a several-step process in dealing with critical response in any medium, but I particularly know it from work-in-progress performances. The kind of performance world that I was in wasn't authored. It wasn't, here's a script, give it to some performers, in the same way as a classical musician might give some sheet music to an orchestra. Instead, it was much more like the way a band makes music. You get together in a room, you try some things out. In devising theatre, you will go into a room, you will do performance games, you'll know what story or question maybe you're interested in, but as a collective, you'll get together and you'll try things out until you find scenes and you put them together and you pull them apart. Very close to narrative design dramaturgy in devising practices. You will put that in front of an audience to see what it's like. It's a playtest, but for performance. But the only way to make a playtest useful is to be able to ask questions and absorb the critique that a person is offering. And there are many things that you need to do that well. One is knowing what you want feedback on. Two is knowing how to ask neutral questions in a supportive way. And three is making sure that you provide a structure for feedback that the person being critical in a way that you've asked for understands what the position is. And there are several stages that she goes through. Some of it's very, very structured and you don't have to use it all, but it's an incredible process to learn from. And I strongly recommend looking up Liz Lerman. Okay, that, as you may hopefully be grateful for, is the end of me talking about me. I mean, yeah, that was enough. I hope some of that was valuable. And I try to be fairly thorough because every one of you is going to go on and be a practitioner, be the practitioner that only you can be. And instead of me saying, this is the only way to learn, or this is the only way to, what I hopefully just communicated to you is that you mostly need to understand yourself and your practice and find ways to develop, understand, and give yourself vocabularies to communicate that practice. So that's why you got the full tour. I'm going to take a sip of my tankard of colored liquid. It's not tea or anything fancy like that. It's it's the Danish equivalent of Kool-Aid, honestly. It's really sweet. I like it.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was amazing. I just want to remind everyone that we have some questions that were pre-asked, and I think Hannah will tackle those first. And Hannah, there were so many great questions and comments coming into the chat. I've recorded those for you, so we have time. I'll share those with you when we get to that point.
Great. I think, yeah, I'm going to go through these questions and I'll try, if these were the only questions we'd have, I'd probably spend a bit more time on them, but I'm going to try and be a little bit fast so we can try and capture everything else. But I'm going to be better prepared on these questions than the ones I get in the chat. And I'm just going to give you fair warning on that. But I'm sure that we'll all be okay with me being less prepared on things that have just been asked. So let's see. I prepared some slides for the pre-prepared people who asked questions before ahead of time. It's going to start with the question, and then I'm going to talk through my answer. So this person asked, during your time in the industry, is the popular trend evolving away from robust storytelling in games, or has narrative depth become more essential over time? Everyone who asked a question, I would strongly recommend going to Liz Lerman and reading all the sections about questions, because I felt like a lot of these questions were kind of halfway between opinion and question in a way that is perfectly acceptable, but not the best kind of communication that you can have. And asking good questions is a really, really powerful way to learn. And I felt like somewhere here, there's a slightly more honest question which I didn't quite get from this question, which is has a little bit of an opinion. I think that this person thinks that there is, the industry is moving away from robust storytelling, but they haven't defined what robust means. Don't worry, I'm going to create every question like this because I think questions are incredibly powerful and useful parts of your practice. So this is absolutely not personal to the person who asked this. So I would encourage this person to reflect on what do they mean by games? What do they mean by the industry? Because my part of the industry is wildly different to other parts of the industry. Like AAA games has much more in common with Hollywood than they do with my part of the games industry. I'm in this sort of weird III space where I'm working with substantial publishers and platforms, but there are technically 3 employees in Digital Fabric, including contractors. There are somewhere between 12 and 14 of us. And my experience of the industry is occasionally intersects with other parts of it, but is very much focused on a different kind of making than. So the industry is just sort of too sort of big for me to be able to say there are 10 trends I can identify in my part of the industry, but they're going to be wildly different trends in other parts of the industry. Robust is another word which I wonder if that needs a little bit more sort of interrogation. Does that mean in depth or challenging or exploring complicated themes? Are you just saying like, are people less interested in storytelling in games? Is that the simplest version of this question? I'm even having to move my little ring light so I can see what I've written. Oh yeah, and I'm back on my like narrative isn't the same as story, hobby horse halfway through these. I mean, no, is probably my answer to this question. I don't think that there are trends in, I see, if you're asking me about the industry, and that's all the way from avant-garde, one-person bedroom art practices, all the way up to AAA, 200-person studio with a fair amount of exploitation going on level of the industry, I would say that there are probably about as many people interested in story as there were a decade ago. I feel like perhaps some AAA like to tell stories now about how they tell stories interestingly. Like Watch Dogs is a really good example. The way that they talk about how, you can, like, any character is going to have a story which you can engage with. And there are really bold indies making, I think one of the most powerful things you can do in games is have a good scope. I think Wide Ocean Big Jacket is a really incredible example of excellent scope. And it's also a game that tells a story really well. Obviously there are big like era defining storytelling games like Chaos. None of those things feel to me like story is falling away. Equally, there are incredibly exceptional mechanics driven games. So I'm not giving a very good answer here because I'm not sure. I'm not sure that this question knows if it's expressing an opinion or if it is a question. There are certainly some things I would like to evolve. For example, vocabulary around storytelling in games, stopping talking about things as being exceptional because they're new, but maybe talking about how they've built on other things, and just not exploiting your workers. Like, that is probably more important to me than storytelling in games. I wouldn't care if we stopped telling stories in games, although I'm not sure that's even possible because I've told you before that, everything has a story world. If not, it's just a bunch of like flat art, in which case, there's a point where abstraction becomes an interesting thing in and of itself. So I do not know how to answer this question, and that sometimes is okay. Let's try the next one. What elements do you personally think are most important when writing a games narrative? We're just going to come back to my like story rather than narrative thing there. Common vocabularies, suitable tools, and time to redraft. Tell you what will make a lot of games better, in like if we're talking about trends, would be if anyone ever writing for games had time to redraft. Everything you read in Mutazione was first draft. There was no way I was going to have time to redraft that game. That in some ways is down to the scale of it. That is in some ways down to the fact that I was brought on relatively late, and it took me a long time to gain the trust of the creative director enough to say, you need to do a huge narrative design overhaul. And in winning that argument, I then had a year to implement it, including localizing in 15 languages. That meant that every word that you see in the game is first draft. It would be a lot better if I had time to redraft it. And redrafting just very rarely happens because it's part of a craft that people are not particularly familiar with. Equally, part of the reason that there is rarely time to redraft is that because very often the tools that you're working with are broken. See not having an undo button or a spell check function. Or rather, that's not a good example. That's like lacking in features that you might expect as part of a writing process, because honestly, any contemporary writer, part of their practice is the undo button and a copy and paste function. I didn't have that either. That would have been really useful. But tools is one of the huge things stopping writing being better, stopping writing being redrafted, because tools, when they are made late, when they mean that you have no way of implementing italics, there are text effects which really bring Mutazione to life. I really felt strongly at the beginning that I never wanted to write laughter. This was not a comic, this was dialogue, and you don't write laughter in dialogue, and so we wanted to use a text effect. I invented a tag to use, like raw in the writing, a little like an HTML tag, a year before that effect was implemented, and more than half a year before I won the argument about having that feature. I was implementing that tag throughout the game long before anyone had said that I could have it. But the fact that I had been fighting that fight and I had been using that tag meant that when we did implement it, then there was laughter in the game. And I didn't have to do the job of going through every single dialogue in the game and working out where laughter needed to be. So, however, if you spec'd a tool for writing with at the same time as you were designing the basics of the game, then you might be able to do much better writing. That is, in fact, the principle on which I am making the next Decode Fabric game. I cannot tell you anything about, but we are in our first year fully speccing our tools, and the main innovation, this is in my like creative like pillars, our main innovation is shit hot writing. It's all in caps, which is the only time I will allow all caps, is in my creative vision document. Okay, so yeah, making narrative design and good writing are very different skill sets, and knowing the difference between those two things is another thing I would really like people to know when writing a game's narrative. What else does it say? Moving this light, basic craft. I've already chatted about all of this stuff. Form-led design. Do you understand what you need the story to do for the game? Is it the main part of the game? Is it a main supporting structure for the game? Or is it a lovely wrapping for the game? Each of those will mean that you make different decisions. And then genre-led design, how that affects your line links, the way that characters talk. Do they use full sentences? Do they use idiomatic expressions? Do they all have the same voice? Because that's important to you. Making those decisions consciously, and show, don't tell. Writing should be a last resort when you are talking about naturalistic dialogue, particularly. Although I would argue if you wanted like things to be funny, then a visual gag is very often more effective than a written gag when you can't apply intonation through performance, or there's parts of the performance which are lacking because it is in somewhere positioned in the uncanny valley. And I've already talked about the gardens between. So what elements do I personally think are most important? They're there: common vocabulary, suitable tools, time to redraft, craft that you can be articulate about, understanding the form that you're working with, understanding the genre you're working with, and show, don't tell. What do we have next? Are there certain places where one could go wrong when developing their own game's story? Any common pitfalls / tips on how to traverse those? Do you want to be a storyteller? I would say that if you don't, then it actually would be a much more valuable skill to you to learn how to collaborate with storytellers. And would encourage you to find people to do that with. Like, if you think the thing that you want to do is be a narrative designer and a writer or creative director, knowing about storytelling is going to be really valuable to you. And you might want to try it anyway to find out if you like that, if you're a civilization career person rather than a to B kind of person. But if you're someone who wants to make games, maybe at a scale of like a studio of 10-ish, which is like a well-established indie, then you should be hiring storytellers unless you want to be that person in the studio. And the most meaningful thing you can do for your practice in developing a game story is learning how to collaborate with storytellers. How do they need to work? What do they need to provide you with? What do they need to know in order to provide you with a story world? What do they need to know about mechanics in order to make sure that the storytelling they want to do highlights and makes them better? Are you a mechanics first game that you need some story world wrapping for? What does this person need to know to make proposals to you? And how can you critically respond to their proposals? And then how do you build the tools to communicate with and work with this person? That might be a much more valuable skill set for you to develop than developing your game story. And you can do that as someone in university, because I am certain that there are creative writing courses at your university as well. I am certain that there are storytellers working in different parts of your university who you can reach out to and say, I would like to practice this thing. And games are cool. So people are going to be like, yeah, that sounds really cool. I want to make a game. What do I need to do? And you get to learn about like project management as well. So that might actually be, just sort of challenging the premise of the question a little bit, that might actually be the most valuable way of you thinking about how you develop your game story, is how you develop your collaborating with storytellers. But if you do want to be and become an experienced storyteller, then we're back to a lot of the things I've covered before, which is building vocabulary, building critical friends with which you can develop your practice, studying how other games, but not just games, like how theatre and dance and TV is a really good one because there are so many different formats out there. Studying Star Trek is a really good example of, like, because most Star Trek episodes have a different format. Today it's the detective episode, or today it's the data tries to understand humans episode. Like, each of those is like, it's like studying Shakespeare's oeuvre, but like just in a TV show. They all have their format. They'll end in a death or a wedding. And, you know, by the end of it, you will have experienced storytelling in a neat package. And then examining that, discussing how it had an effect on you and why it did, understanding how it subverted your expectations or pertained to your expectations, I don't know what the word I'm looking for there is, will help you understand better how to tell stories. So make cover games, think about a story that you really love. Maybe it's a song that you really love, but something that has a story in it that's really important to you. It's a painting, I don't really mind, but try and make a cover game of it. Think about, okay, this film is really important to me, but don't try and make that film like a film in a game. Think about, what is the story this film tells me, and how would that be best expressed in a game? All of these are critical practices which will really teach you about the material of storytelling. And then finally, a fair amount of developing game stories is tools, documentation, tracking, the boring shit. So like, pay attention to the boring shit as well, because that's important. And we're on to the second to last of the pre-prepared questions, which I'm hopefully zipping through at some pace. Where do you even begin when it comes to building your own team/studio? I think this is the strongest question because it was just really honest. Where do you even begin? Good question. I got some men to give me their studio, so that's not a very good, I mean, it worked, but building from scratch, these are the things which I think that you need to really consider when thinking about setting up a studio. Money. What does money mean to you? Do you want to make it? Do you need it? What does that mean for how you build the structures, whether those be official or whether those be collaborative structures? Money is going to define all of those things. So money, is it a thing you want to make? Is it a thing you want to use? Or is it a thing you want to avoid entirely? That's one of the central pillars in thinking about how you are going to build a team or studio. Collaboration and how you support it. Do you want to be a band? putting things together in a room and seeing how they work out? Do you want to be a hierarchy? And hierarchies are not inherently bad. Do you want other organizational practices like anarchic practices, where you may need a certain amount of consensus around decisions and then plan in all the extra time that will take you? So collaboration and how you support it, because the systems and the processes that you design will enable or disable certain kinds of collaboration. Ownership and how you design it. If you are founding a company with more than just you, then you are already having to have the discussion about what it means to be working on a project or with this team. There is a point where money becomes involved, that ownership becomes much more important. And in paying people, you will need to set up ideas around limited companies and perhaps board members. And you will probably want to have a discussion, again, related to money, about if people who found the company have shares in the company and things like that. You don't have to make decisions where people have to own this thing, but you do want to have the discussion of who does this work belong to when there's more than one person, because that is fair. It's not bad and dirty to think about that stuff. It's actually protecting all of you to think about that stuff. And it's also protecting the most vulnerable people who might not be comfortable asking about that stuff, are not used to being granted that stuff. So money and how you relate to it, collaboration and how you support it, ownership and how you design it, communication and how you support it. Are you a remote studio? Where are you based? Are you all going to be working in the same room together? Do you need certain, what kind of personalities are in this team? And how can you empower everyone to do their best as often as they like? And that includes making sure that different kinds of communicators are supported. Some people like to argue their way through questions. Some people like to think about it, go away, write some things down, come back again. Paying attention to what kind of communicators are in your team will enable you to empower them to do their best communication. And most of game design is interdisciplinary communication, so that's kind of important. Diversity and how you foster it. Your games, your ideas, your time on this earth will be better if your team is more diverse. And that means not just looking around for people like you to work with. That means thinking interdisciplinarily, but it also means making sure that you're not a room of people who all look like you, and doing the work it takes to find people who are not just like you. That sometimes means that you don't make the easy hire. That sometimes means spending 3 months talking to people and paying people for their consultation to find a person of color for a position rather than another white dude for a position. That work is worth doing because it just makes the whole industry better, and it makes your future better, and it makes your practice and your storytelling better. So that has to be, as far as I'm concerned, part of building a team in a studio. How do you relate to that question, diversity, and how you foster it? And that includes like age. Like if you're making a thing and you're only like sharing it to and making it with people who are like 21, and that's fine, but I realized recently I needed to like mute a bunch of like really interesting practitioners who were all like, there was a preponderance of people saying really, as far as I was concerned, like annoying shit on Twitter. And I just realized they were all young practitioners who needed to get that stuff out of their systems, just as I did when I was 21. I needed to say bold, stupid shit when I was 21. And that is part of the process. But one of the things about theatre is that there's a really strong network of mentoring. And like you build bids for public money, and a lot of that involves getting support in kind, which is like support which you can count against money, which actually isn't money. This person gave me 5 days of their time, and that is equivalent to £1,000 of funding. And that means that I spent a lot of my practice around people in their 40s and 50s and 60s, as well as young practitioners. And I think that massively accelerated my practice and my learning. So there are many different diversities, but I think age is one of the things, and maturity of practice is another one of those things which isn't often highlighted as much. Diversity is not a thing that it's not just it's very easy to think, to be in my position. I'm a currently perfectly well-off white woman from the Western world, and my diversity work is charity. It's helping. That's bullshit. Like my work is better. I grow, and my practice is better because I take the time to foster diversity in the work that I do. And if you're also fostering good communication, you have room to listen and support different kinds of practices and backgrounds. And then the final question, I talked a bit too long there. The final question is scale. And this is probably, I left this to last because all of those things change as you scale. If you scale, you need to think about money differently. You need to think about collaboration differently. There is a point, I honestly believe, where you just need some fucking hierarchies. If you've gone beyond like 15 people, you need someone who makes the decision, or you're extremely rich and you never have to make any money or worry about paying anyone. You can collaborate for 10 years, which Mutazione did, but for different reasons. You can work for 10 years on an anarchic 50-person team if you really, really want to, and you probably produce some really interesting shit, and that's fine. But a lot of us has to get paid. And as we scale, you need to constantly revise how you think about the means by which you foster diversity, the ways you support collaboration and communication, how you need to define different levels of ownership. So sometimes in games, this is expressed as rev shares. So you might have people who own the company, but people who work on the game might get shares of the revenue. I don't think that's very fair, honestly, myself, in the ways that I've seen it kind of work. It's often a little bit fucked up. I actually have defined a success pool for the people who are working on next game. So just basically, no matter how long you work on the game or how much your work is seen as being worth, if you work for at least 1 day a week over 6 months or more on the game, you'll be entered into the success pool if you want to be. You can choose to opt out, although I'm not sure why you would. And then if the game makes any money that comes into Digue de Fabrique, 20% of that will be set aside into the success pool, and that's paid out in equal shares to everyone in that pool. I've been in a lot of shitty rev share situations, so that's my solution to that. There's probably better ones that that people will work out later. But ask yourself, are you an indie band? Do you want to get together with a few friends and make a thing? That's cool. You don't need to scale. You can do that forever. You might have to have a day job. You might have to think carefully about caring responsibilities if you want to have a family, what that means for that stuff. But that is not a wrong way of doing things. And you do not have to want to scale to make cool, interesting, valuable shit in this world. Really asking yourself, interrogating, is it a hobby? Is it an art form? Is it research interest? Is it a livelihood? And think about what that means for, unless you are rich. If you're rich, you can just ignore this. You can ignore anything because you can just go around the world and do what you like. That's fine. If you are not rich, then you're going to have to think about the compromises involved and what matter to you about how you make a business, how you make a hobby, how you make a work of art, how you develop your research, and how you make this your livelihood. And always be interrogating those choices. Sounds pretty tiring, doesn't it? Taking time to rest and then taking time to reflect on your practice and the choices that you make. That's how you begin to build your own team/studio. Go with the first bullet points because I talked a bit too much then. I'm not going to go into ways to fund games. There are many. One of them is being rich. The rest involve lots of signing of scary forms, lawyers, filling out of forms. The most valuable thing that I think that I was ever told is that you should be able to look at your budget and be able to read the story of the project in it. You should be able to look at a budget and see how this is made, who is being hired when, how much they cost, how the story of this game being made is told through money. And the most useful thing I think that I've ever articulated with regards to filling out forms to get money, whether that be government grants, academic funding, arts funding, is to listen to the form and understand the funder, understand what story they want to tell with the result of their spending their money. The UK Games Fund want to say that the UK is an exciting technological place. The Arts Council, them in the UK, their main remit is great art for everyone. The everyone is really key there. So you make sure that your application says how this reaches out to particular communities who maybe don't normally get to art. The DFI, the Danish Film Institute, they are interested in the identity of Denmark, a quote, big little nation. They want to know how people fostered in Denmark are out there making sure people know that Denmark exists. Listen to the funder. They will tell you in how they talk about themselves and how they talk about the funding, and in the framing of their questions, the story that they want to tell with how they spend their money. You need to tell them the story of how you will help them do that. And in the meantime, separate to that, you'll be making your thing. You don't have to change what you want to make in order to tell that story. You just need to give them the argument for how what you wanted to make anyway helps them tell the story about how their money was well spent. So there are lots of, yeah. Another good example is platforms. Like platforms want a game sometimes because they want like cool indie games to make their place look more interesting. Like that's a really good way to pitch yourself. This question is not good communication. I'm going to read it out. Of the work you have created or collaborated on, which one resonates with you the most in the context of what we are all going through? And do you think games will be the next medium to become our primary monocultural event that replaces the epic? I'm going to be a critical friend to this question because it takes a lot of time to learn how to ask good neutral questions, and this is very much not one of them. And it involves a lot of really chewy, over academicized words which provide a bunch of lack of context. There is no way for me to necessarily know what you mean by primary monocultural event, and that might be something you've read recently and got really excited about, but better communication would break that down a little bit. So I'm going to try and answer some of it. Like, what do you mean by the current moment? Do you mean the pandemic? Do you mean like capitalism? Do you mean climate crisis? Do you mean cissexism, racism? There are plenty ingredients to what we're currently through. And I feel like somewhere buried in this is the idea that, you know, games being special, which I've already sort of said I don't agree with. There are many different people who will tell you that games are special. That's not me, and that's okay. You can decide which one of us you want to listen to. I don't want a primary medium of our age. I'm an interdisciplinary maker who's inspired by lots of different practices, and I don't want a primary medium, and I would dispute the idea that there is one. I do think that this is, if I'm reading this question correctly, I think what you're asking me is like, do you think games will be Game of Thrones, that everyone will be like gathered around the water cooler saying, I have not watched Game of Thrones, so I'm a bad example for games being a monocultural event. Like, did you see when the guy with the dragon and the sword? There you go. I'm going to imagine what Game of Thrones is like. I hope there's a dragon and a sword somewhere. And it was like, yes, I did see the guy with the dragon and the sword, and then the woman with the lady with the sword and not the dragon. That may be what you mean by primary monocultural event. Replacing the epic. I don't know if the epic is long-running TV shows. Is that what that means? I'm just trying to express to you that you will learn better and develop your practice better with questions which are good at communicating things other than a pre-established opinion that you may or may not want affirming. Anyway, I don't think games will become the next, I hope that they won't become the next primary monocultural event that replaces the epic. If you're looking for monocultural, like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean, are we just ignoring all of the world that isn't white and Western? I'm not sure. But like, I think Pokemon Go was a pretty, like, an event that captured a large amount of the world in a moment. I think Angry Birds did that. I think that solitaire has been present in so many people's lives for a super long amount of time. And in some ways you could argue and that is a game that is so part of people's lives that they probably don't think about themselves as a gamer if they play it. But I really hope that they don't become a monocultural event or the medium of the era, because I think that that will just make all art and storytelling and games practices less interesting. I would turn this question around to the questioner and encourage you to think about, why do you need your work to be important and worthy and the medium of the era? It might be that you've got things you want to say about the world, and that's okay, but like turn to those things and your practice and think through how you want to ask people about them or discuss them or talk about them, and look at how other mediums and other people are discussing and asking those same things. If by this question you're just like, I want to make a thing that everyone like talks about and is interested in, then you might want to make TV, honestly, for now. And that is cool. This is like a really valuable question, though. When we get down to it, I start off by saying this is not a question. This is sort of a complicated opinion disguised with some overcomplicated language. But when we come down to it, actually at the heart of this question, I would turn to you and say, why are you making games? What do you want them to be? What are the experiences or playgrounds or stories that you want to bring into the world? What interests you about games as a tool or a material or a process? And how can you lean into that in your practices? Because to me personally, to come to the end, the beginning of that question, which is like of stuff that I've created or worked on, what resonates with me the most, to me, it is the work and not the medium, which is the thing. The medium certainly shapes the work, but I choose the medium in order to best express the work that I'm interested in. And I would give you maybe like a few examples. Songs for Breaking Britain was a punk show that toured the country and listened to people on the street at a moment when there was a real sense of voicelessness. And I feel very proud of how that pushed my practice, because I had not sung in front of people before and I was the front woman in a punk band, and it pushed my practice in ways that challenged me out of my comfort zone. And as a practitioner, that was really valuable, and also as a political work, it was interesting to me. But probably the most powerful political work I did was when I took a bunch of money from a funder and I used a very small amount of it to pay myself to make a thing, and I gave the rest to a housing occupation so that they could feed some children for a month. That was a much more effective piece of work than any other political work that I've ever done in art terms. I am proud of the sheer scale of Mutazione as a piece of work that I did and held in my head and made work with the tools at my disposal. But I think one of the things I'm most proud of in the current time and the things that we are going through are all of the complicated decisions. And this relates to that earlier question about how you run a studio and a team, all the complicated decisions I am making every single day to try and empower and support a group of people to do the best they can to make a cool thing. I get up every week, and one of the first things I do is that I read the coronavirus news for every country of every person that I'm working with, because I want to know that Austria have implemented a curfew, which means I want to give active permission to Katrin, our Austrian lead programmer, to go to the supermarket in the middle of the day. I don't want her to have to feel like she's sneaking away because she needs some food and she can't wait until dark to do it. So I say, Katrin, I just heard about the curfew. Make sure you take some time today to go and do all the things that you might need to do. Or, for example, in Denmark, it doesn't affect me personally. I don't have any kids, but they closed the schools. And so I take some time and I sit down with Nils and Morten. Danish dads are very hands-on. And I sit down and I talk to them about how we can reduce their hours and make sure that they have the time to look after their kids and do the things that they need to do, and how flexible can we be with time. That I consider as important a practice as the making of the actual game itself, because the process and the environments in which we make games are also making games. Equally, the designing of internships, which are supportive, that try and think through every single barrier that might face you and take it down. In the face of equalities legislation in Denmark, which doesn't allow you to take positive action. So I can never say this internship is directly aimed at marginalized people. I can't say that. It is against the law. I will be breaking qualities legislation. So I do the best I can. I consult a lot with lawyers. I spend a lot of money on lawyers to do the best I can to communicate that this is open and as accessible as possible, removing all the barriers that I know will stand in the way of marginalized people, taking consultation on that to make sure that it is. And then I will also this year try and work out how to change the law, because that's just fucked up. Positive action is really important. And I'm going to learn some Danish and talk to some members of Danish parliament and try and say to them in stories that they will understand. I will say, I think this makes me less competitive as a Danish business if I cannot actively recruit people, because this is a very international industry, and I will try and use the language of business to get them to make the case in parliament for positive action as part of equalities legislation. So all of those things are things that I'm proud of. This is the conclusion of the like pre-AMAs, and these are the things I would like you to take from them. The previous question, I really don't want the person to ask this to feel shitty. I am being a pain in the fucking ass by challenging the premise of all these questions. And I do so because I think asking good questions is a really powerful way to move your practice on quickly. And so I do that out of a good, positive teaching spirit, and as someone who's asked fucking pain in the ass questions as a 21-year-old. I would like you to take from this the idea that games aren't special, that they aren't going to be the next medium, that there's no one medium. This should be freeing. It should be a wonderful thing for you, I hope, because in understanding that games aren't inherently special, you can think about all the ways that you particularly and your practice can make them special. This hopefully should allow you to reflect on yourself as a practitioner, to think about how you might grow your skills, your crit skills, your craft, and to separate your career from your practice and think about how to nurture your practice and all the ways in which you will sometimes have to make career decisions which do not do that. But in taking care of your practice, taking care of yourself, you will be able to make that career work for you better. Consider the material, the form, the genre that you work with, develop your vocabulary in a specialist way, really understand these things. This previous question is halfway there because there's some really fucking specialist vocabulary there. The next step on for that is understanding the complex specialist vocabulary in your head, but then asking the question or saying the thing in a way which is clear to everyone who might not have that context or might not have that vocabulary. So develop your specialist vocabularies and then develop the skills or the practice of translating that to everyone in a way that they can understand and they can hold in their heads. Remember the phrase, that is a non-trivial change, one of the most valuable ones that I have. And then finally, write it down. Whether that's documenting your practice and things you've learned and your experiences and then being able to reflect on them, or whether that's like actually just fucking creating a spreadsheet of all the things that you need the game to do. A lot of making a video game is very mundane and it involves spreadsheets, and that is my final point. That's not a very cheery final point, is it? Grow into wonderful, free, critical practitioners is the summary on that. That is the end of the AMAs that were already pre-prepared. And Laura, I now encourage you to guide me through any further ones. I'm here with pen and paper.
All right. Thank you so much, Hannah. We do have a lot of great questions. I think your talk inspired a lot of great questions. So thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and experiences. I do want to be conscious of both your time and the audience's time. We're 3 minutes shy from 2. So you can let me know if you are happy to stay a little bit longer. We can begin asking questions. Just wanted to check in.
I was definitely 10 minutes late in starting because I couldn't make the videos work. So I'm really happy to do another 10 minutes. And I'm also not going to find it rude if anyone leaves. And yeah, so that, I don't know, like 3 or 4 extra questions, that feels like.
All right. Well, we have about 10 extra questions. Maybe we'll do the first 4 or however many we get in the next few minutes. And then if you like, I could, I can email you the rest of the questions if you have the time. All right. The first question is from Catherine. When you write, do you have a specific message or theme in mind, or does that naturally develop from the story idea?
I think that assumes far more control than you would usually have. I'm normally being asked into a thing, and there's already been a story and a theme, or they've already made a bunch of assumptions that mean there are a limited number of story or themes that I can start with. If you're in the situation of being students who are, in the very lucky position of starting things from scratch, that's when you need those skills. But as a practitioner working in writing and narrative design, I'm brought in very late and I'm given a story they already imagined, and they're just like, yeah, make that work with these things that we've done. And so I am very often unpicking damaging themes and messages. A large amount of Mutazione's characters were a little bit insulting when I came to them. Some of the things they would say, they were written by a woman, but they were pretty sexist. I don't know, like, where that was coming from. I didn't like it. There was a bunch of fat phobia in one of the characters, and a couple of things that were just telling slightly cliched things. So I did a lot of undoing that with the permission of the creative director. And the more that I worked with him on what he felt was important about the story that I was telling, it was important to him that it was about this community who had grown like closer to nature in a way that was different to the world outside, and that people had come in and tried to take from that, and that had caused damage to the community. I was like, this is a story about colonialism. I think I'm gonna find a way to like make. I think it's pretty clear that Nono is suffering from a real bad case of white man's guilt, which is not helping anyone. He's trying to fix a problem that actually it's not his right to fix. And so I turned the conclusion of the game into him realizing that with the help of the central character, and with the support of a Black American woman who helped me, who was our sensitivity reader, because I'm a white woman who shouldn't assume I know how to tell anti-colonial story. And that was also not good enough because we were all a fucking all white team, and core team at least. And that is not good enough. And I changed that in the next game as well. The next game, that's, we are as games go, pretty diverse team. So do I start with theme and a message? No. I am mostly picking up broken themes and broken messages and working out how to undo the damage that's been done to them. There's not been one thing where I haven't done that. If I was starting from scratch, I would. When I personally start from scratch, I'm thinking about who I want to collaborate with. I'm not thinking about a theme or a message. I'm thinking about who excites me, who is super shit hot at what they do, and who is inspiring to me. And I want them in a room with me, and I want to design processes which allow me to collaborate with them. That is much more important to me than a theme or a message, because games, more so than any other form, are collaborative, interdisciplinary forms. And I think when you have the shit hot people in the room together, and because I need to secure money to do that, I'm certainly pitching the thing. And that starts with someone who I think, someone already around me who's shit hot has like said, all right, like, this is a mechanic I've really been thinking about. Or I might have been saying, oh, I'm really interested in like long running TV shows, and I want to lean into that a bit more, like a spark. But my sparks are often format driven or genre driven, and not about a message or a theme, because I think those are the things that always come later. So if you are a little bit stuck, you don't know where to start, I would definitely surround yourself by shit hot people, and somewhere in that you will find cool shit. Sorry for again denying the premise of the question in two different ways.
That was great. Then we have a question from Adam. How does one advocate for the important to you thematic elements of story in a game, and when the needs of gameplay or production are pushing against them?
Understand how many chips you're playing with, understand what the stakes are, and really take the time to understand other people's disciplines. Like, understand when you are asking for a non-trivial thing, and be really prepared to explain how much better the thing will be if they implement the change that you are suggesting. Part of that is humility. Part of that is communication. And part of that is sympathy. I think that if people see that you are making all of those efforts, they will trust you when you say things. I, for example, have worked with some really bad tech leads who say no to everything, and I just stop believing them. Like, I have a decent enough idea about what is like possible and impossible. And if you're, I don't accept no as an answer. I want you to tell me why you think this is out of scope. If you think adding italics is unimportant, that is very different to italics will literally take me 8 months to implement. It wasn't the latter. It was just that no one thought that italics were important, but it, you know, it actually took half a week and playing with TextMesh Pro to make it happen. And then there were some design concerns about it, understanding how your decisions have knock-on effects. If you are in a company that you've just been brought into, I would also be strategic. I would work out who might be more likely to come on side with you. I would talk to them and think through it with them, make your proposal better, more robust, and make sure it has their support and their resources behind it. So finding your allies and strengthening your cause in that way will mean that when you call the design discussion, or that it comes up in a design discussion, you are better equipped and you have a stronger backline to support you. So advocating is actually an incredibly sympathetic thing. You're always dealing with people's work, and if you're lucky, you're working with people who understand that in the opposite direction as well. So good communication, good sympathy, being able to articulate your practice, as I've said before, explain why this will make everything better. And to give you a final example of like how this particularly worked, for a long time, it took me about half a year to get a big narrative design discussion around the gardens in Mutazione, because there is a gardening mechanic. And people had been speaking for a long time about how the gardening was supposed to be delightful, but never to like block the story. It should never be a puzzle that you can't solve. And then people were also saying that they invented this medicine mixing, and I did a lot of like world work on building a very complicated medicine theory for the community and the world of the game. And the idea was that you could find plants and solve people's medical stuff by coming across them and then doing the research and all of the resources we gave you. But all of this decentered character and story and centered the gardens. And it was interesting. But I asked the creative director to tell me whether the characters and the story were the most important thing, or whether the gardens and the music were the most important thing. And I asked him to make a decision, because narrative design could solve one of those two problems, but not both of them. And he thought about it, and he'd had this ensemble cast in his mind for over 15 years. And he said, it is the story and the characters. And so we took out medicine mixing, and we made I made each garden relate to a character. So you actually solved a character's problem by completing a garden, and in solving that problem, you would heal the community in a small way, or you would enable the community to start healing itself. And in doing so, you would move the story forward and you would uncover more of the mystery. So in that way, the gardens became an underlying structure of the narrative design and not an overlying one. So really understanding what your creative directors or people who aren't a specialist in your area want as an effect, and making them make the decisions for you, presenting them with the options, and when doing nothing is not an option, is a very good way of fighting in a way that doesn't look like it's a fight.
That's so true. So good. We have, this is a double question from Adonis and Madeline. One is, could we get Hannah's top 10 games of 2020? And then added to that, what are some of the games you think might have great storytelling and or strong narrative elements? And then in the chat, Adonis just amended that maybe we could make it 5 top games for 2020.
I don't even remember 10 games. answer this. Top 10 games. My interdisciplinary heart goes, no, why games? Why just games? Like, why can't I give you films and like online performances? The best experience I had last year was a dance performance in PowerPoint. Someone made a PowerPoint of thousands of slides, which was like stop motion, but when you hit play, it was like a video of someone doing a pirouette on a beach, a young brown man doing a pirouette on a beach, a trained young brown male dancer doing a pirouette on a stony beach. And every time that loop repeated, you didn't realize it at first, but the contrast was just being blown up a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And every time it repeated, it got blown out and blown out and blown out until shapes became colors and you still saw the movement. And it was a really beautiful fucking dance piece made in PowerPoint. That was probably one of the best things that happened in 2020. It was an artwork made by a director and a dancer during the first UK lockdown. I play Slay the Spire every day. I have never been first in but I have been second. And I'm rarely out of the top 50. And it is a bit like my relationship to sport in that it is a place where my brain switches off and I turn into instincts, but sport turns me into a body in the world, centers me in a different way, to Slay the Spire, which takes my problem-solving brain and just goes, just I know that there's a huge stressor in the world that you can't solve right now, which is that you live in a country different to most of your friends and family, and you won't be able to visit them probably for like 2 years, and you haven't been hugged by another human being, let alone touched by one, for 6 months. But if you just go and solve all these little card problems, then the rest of your brain can have a break. So Slay the Spire, probably one of the most useful therapeutic things in my life right now. I play a lot of games for like an hour and a half to get a sense of how they do what they do. But I don't play many games all the way through. And I also think it's really okay to make games and not like many of them. I get really excited when I see a game do a thing well, but I think a lot of them don't. And that's okay. And they do some things for other people. But I don't like a top 10 list. I like the man dancing in PowerPoint on the stony beach. I like Slay the Spire a lot. I played enough of If Found to know that that's really beautiful. My friend, Jake gave me a code for KRZ, the TV edition, and Act 5, and I haven't played it yet just because I think it's probably, I haven't got the brain space to play good things, honestly. I spend all my time making my brain work really hard. The best film I saw this year is Woman at War. Iceland, set in Iceland. It's a woman who leads a choir in her spare time, is trying to adopt a child, but mostly is an eco-terrorist. And she's like knocking down power pylons and stuff. And it ends in this really, really beautiful, this is the last thing I'll recommend you. I'll stop talking after this. It ends in this really beautiful scene. One of the things about that movie is that the music is the orchestral music is diegetic, in that there is just a band that follows her around, and sometimes they just start playing and they wait for a pause and they're like, oh, okay, this is my cue, and she sort of knows that they're there, but they're also not there. There are just small points of slightly and I'm not finding the right critical language here because I'm a little bit tired, but like slightly abstractness, which just lifts the whole story. And the girl that she's adopting is from Lithuania, and these Lithuanian folk singers next to these like Irish folk band that become two textures as the story goes on. And she's competing between this thing where she wants to be a mother, but also she needs to save the world. And it ends with her with this child, and suddenly it's just been raining. It's been raining. She's gone to pick up the child, and the flood. There's a flood happening, and the waters, they rise and rise and rise, and the bus, suddenly the water is by the windows, and they just have to stop And she gets out with her suitcases floating on the top of the water and holding this child as high as she can. And it just ends with her walking into the water. And it was just such a beautiful mix of slightly heightened drama, theatricalism, actually, next in a very naturalistic thing, talking about like just the relationship to the land and the moss of Iceland that's really important to this character, which is really beautiful. And I wish Parasite had ended that way. I wish the floodwaters had just risen and risen and risen until everything was underwater. There was a second question. Did I answer that? Great storytelling. Probably If Found. There you go. Go play that. It's an Irish story about LGBTQ, like young trans character in fairly written by a company which is led by trans folks in conservative Ireland. It's interesting. There are lots of really nice Irish words. They don't try and erase the Irishness of the writing, which is great. And there's lots of little footnotes that tell you what things mean if they're Irish words.
So great. I need to watch Women at War now.
Mm.
There's one more question. Well, if we wanted to fit one more question in, we can. But I also, Leanne asked in the chat if you knew if this was the link to the dance PowerPoint, which sounds amazing.
That doesn't look like the right. No, I don't think so. It was. Oh, there it is. There it is. Pure Summer. So it is actually part of that collection, but let me paste the direct one. This is the, that's privately. Let me send it to the whole everyone. I am not a pro Zoom user. There you go. That is the precise PowerPoint that I'm talking about.
That's so great. Thank you. So it's 15 minutes past, and I know it's late for you, Hannah. And you've been...
I can take more if it means I don't have to write any emails.
Let's see. The next one is from, thank you so much for your time. This is so nice of you.
I'm going to play some Slay the Spire afterwards. I'm going to be great. So don't worry about me.
The next one is from Fiona. How would one balance a multi-protagonist story in a story-driven game?
I would say that rarely does a multi-protagonist story work, and I think a really good example of it not working is the name of the game. It's like pixely, but they use this shader that makes it like Octopath Traveler. Good example of how that doesn't work. You're not writing a multi-protagonist game. You're writing an ensemble cast story, and there's a big difference with how you would approach those things. Multi-protagonist is that everyone has to be the hero of the story, and doesn't really work in my experience. I think actually Love Actually is a good example of multi-protagonism working, because that's not an ensemble. It's not about how all of them are traveling or experiencing or are part of a community together, which can do a lot of the heavy lifting, because in that case you consider the ensemble cast, the community, the character also. And think about that as a texture of the storytelling. Multi-protagonists in Love Actually precisely works because each of them is a famous person. So you sort of already know who, like, oh, this is the Hugh Grant character, or this is the Colin Firth character. And that is a texture of why that storytelling is effective. You may or may not think that Love Actually is quote unquote good, but it is successful in its multi-protagonism. You know where you are always. You follow the story, and you follow the stories as they are woven together, because everyone looks different enough or is famous enough that you know where you are. So I would argue that multi-protagonism, really, really fucking difficult to pull off, especially when you can't identify them with living, breathing, inhabitable people who can do a lot of that work for you. So I would suggest that you consider instead that maybe you're writing an ensemble cast experience. I'm not sure what kind of game, if you would call it a game, that it is that you're interested in. And then how do you balance it? Well, you consider that the community is a character. You consider that the place where the ensemble cast are is a character. Just a really simple thing like Sex in the City, New York is like the fifth character. I know a lot of people say that it's boring. It's true. And then in balancing the in Mutazione, for example, how I invited you to get to know the community is that each day the A plot, which is the things that you needed to do to move the story forwards, which was connected to the big mystery, it would pull in a different character as part of the B plot, which is a major story for that day. And then there'd be lots of little C plots, which you could explore maybe across several days or maybe just that day. It wouldn't matter if you ever missed a C plot. The experience would be a little empty if you only ever engaged with the B plot connected to the A plot. But if the B plot encouraged you to get interested in a couple of characters, you might seek them out the next day. And then also, as I said, thinking about the texture of the place and the place that they inhabit, I made sure that the characters had rhythms, that they were always in certain places at certain times of the day. So if you got interested in a character because I pulled them into the A plot via a substantial B plot, then the next day you might go, oh, Mari will be in the cafe making lunch, and I'm pretty sure that she's going to have some gossip on the fact that Dennis and Claire got together. No, it's not Dennis and Claire, is it? I forgot the game that I wrote. Spike and Claire. And so you might go and visit her and see what's going on. So you see how structure can be really strong in helping you. And that's why the craft is important. It's not about mysterious, mystical, how do you balance it? Do I need to give them more lines or this more lines? Like actually really just simply going, what is the main plot? What do you have to do to progress the game? How do I weave different characters into this at different points? How do I make sure that the player can orient themselves and make choices about what they do dig into and what they choose not to dig into? That can be really helpful. As an example. Challenge the premise of the question and gave an answer to the question. You got to give me that one.
So I want to thank you again. I want to say that I think because you're so generous with your answers, I'm going to pick one more. And I think you've covered some of these. Let me know in the chat if you guys think not. Some of the other questions have been slightly answered in your previous in the previous answers. So I was picking one. I'm going to pick one at random from the hat to be the last question for the night. Does that sound good to everyone? Or the afternoon? It's night for Hannah, the afternoon for us. So let's see.
It's really rainy here. Rainy night.
Is it?
Storm. It's got a name. It's Storm something. I don't know. Storm Christopher, I think.
All right.
Sorry,
Here is a question from Adam. You've organized Diagute Fabrique in an incredibly humane way, which seems pretty unusual in the games industry, not to mention, all industry. Do you think that approach can scale to a game company with 100 or several hundred people?
Good question. Good question. I could do it with 50. And I could do it with 100 people where you're working on 3 self-contained projects. But 100 people working on the same thing, I don't know if you can do that. And I think part of humane practices are like not making people go to an office if they don't want to. And I think that I think part of the reason I'm struggling to answer this question immediately and articulately is because I have no interest in scaling to 100 people. So it is not a problem I have set my brain to answer before now. I do know people of around the 40 to 50 mark who I think are doing a good job of this. I would pick out, this is me not knowing the names of things. Lissy is one of their producers. This is my other screen. Lissy Kane, Australian company, and the company is called League of Geeks. I have spoken to them quite a lot and they've scaled recently, and I think that they are doing a really good job of it. I do not think that Diku de Fabrique is currently sustainable. And I would say that that is because I have created a good, supportive, and well-balanced, empowering workspace for everyone but me. I am lying awake at night thinking of things that will make things better and solving problems. and not sleeping, and everyone else works a 4-day week, but sort of low-key working most days, and that is absolutely unsustainable and not a thing that I think is heroic by any means. But I am working on a principle of you solve the problem for everyone else first, in the same way as I would pay everyone else first before paying me if there was limited money. So not to say that I don't take fairly radical care of myself, and there are some days where I will spend 3 hours riding my bike and then start work at 3 p.m. and work until like 10 p.m. ish. And definitely the only answer that I have to that is good producers, like making sure that your values are reflected in the people that you hire, because you're going to have hierarchies. And two things: you do not want anyone to think that that is a family. You do not want anyone to present a company, especially one that large, as a family ever. You want everyone to be able to turn up to that thing thinking that it is a job that they have the right to leave behind, and they have a right to be treated humanely in. So you want producers who align with your values. I think it would be all right. I think if you said, Hannah, your life depends on making a thing that scales to 100 people and is humane, and you can do it in any way or time amount that you would like, I would say, yes, I can do that. It takes me 10 years. It takes me 10 years, and you give me unlimited money. And what I'm going to do is spend my time finding fucking good producers, and building my hiring practices in a way that genuinely fosters and self-selects diverse communicators. And it's going to be the communication thing, which really means that people can express and articulate in a situation where they are, we're doing our best to empower them. But part of that is people being able to tell you what will make them better empowered or better supported. And sometimes it doesn't mean that they have to come to you a fully formed communicator, but it means that you need to listen and learn the kind of communicators that they are and provide resources for them to develop. So like that would be like a huge framework of professional development, mentors. Every time I promote someone in the company, like our previous lead had a really shitty year last year for reasons I won't go into because they're super personal to him. And I said to him, we're all paid the fucking same. If you want to step back from this lead role in order to deal with like all of this bullshit. I also made sure that the company paid for his therapy and all of that kind of stuff, and gave him a bunch of time off. But that we still needed someone to be tech lead. So with his support, we asked Katrin to step into that role. And I immediately paired her with a mentor, someone who was in a role where they were working with a lead creative, not a lead programmer, not with a lead who was a creative and not the programming isn't creative. You know what I mean? I don't have programming skills. I have very limited programming skills. And that means a certain kind of tech leadership is required and a very honest relationship. So I immediately paired her with someone who was in a similar experience, but 5 to 10 years later on in their career. And that, just those shortcuts to experience and being able to sound yourself out, particularly with someone who is outside of the company, especially when their closest relationship should be with me in the company, but they need someone outside of it to go, is Hannah asking me to do something I should push back on? When the only other person they could ask is me. That's not a good situation. So I would do that over 10 years, really shit hot producers, really shit hot, accessible, long, slow hiring processes, not hiring for experience, but hiring for aptitude, which is